Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the policies and methods and devices that can be used to encourage the mass immigration mob, 95% of whom, in my view, are just freeloaders, and encourage them to go back to where they came from or to another place, I suppose, but just to leave the Western countries where they're quite clearly a massive burden and causing all sorts of problems with escalating costs and reduction in services and savage reductions in the quality of life that white Western citizens are suffering as a consequence of this mass immigration of unneeded, illiterate third world surplus population peasants. So now, mass deportation, as in physically sort of removing people, even the Trump administration, where people who were in the country illegally and already had deportation orders against them through the courts, even enforcement of that was treated as Nazis and fascists and all that sort of thing. So even where it's 100% legitimate deportation, no one takes any notice of these orders, and they live and exist and work illegally all across the West. So physical deportation by people in uniforms is always going to be open to, see, that's Hitler. Hitler would do that. So really the issue comes down to, in practical terms, to self-deportation. So how can these mass immigrants who are of no use to the Western economies, how can they be encouraged to self-deport and again go back to where they came from, or indeed to another country? Now, there are various things, and I've spoken to a lot of, say, Indians, because a lot of Indians in Australia, and Chinese and so on too, and others, but Indians and Chinese being the biggest ones. So the Indians come to Australia or the West with no intention at all of integrating, none whatsoever. They want to remain, culturally, genetically, and spiritually separate from the community. So they are creating a nation within a nation, and they think they've got every right to do that. So, but why they come to the West is because they can get so many benefits, but why do they stay, and what would encourage them to go back? Well, there's a few things. Given they want to maintain genetic purity, they insist that they have to be able to bring husbands and brides out from the village of their ancestors in India. And that's very, very important to them. So if you cut that off, and they say, well, no, you can't do that. We're not going to regulate, if you come to Australia to be a citizen, I mean, if you want to be on a 3-year work visa or something, that's different. But if you want to come and live in Australia and have a citizenship thing, then you must accept our law. We do not accept arranged, marriages and importing brides and that sort of thing. And so that's just not going to fly. So that would, a lot of Indians simply won't tolerate that. That's just not on. And so that would encourage a lot of them, not to come. And if that law was, it would encourage them to leave Australia. And that they only use as a bolt hole, really, anyway. They're only here to parasite off the rich economy that white people have created. So, and the next thing would be, and this is again very much part of the Indian thing, the next thing is that they want to be able to send money that they make in Australia back to their relatives in India. Now, $10 in Australia might not go very far, but $10 in India does go much further. Remember, they're the average wage as in per capita GDP. The average wage in India is less than $2,000. So $10, $20, is a lot of money. But that money means it's not being spent in Australia to the benefit of the Australian economy. Many of the Indians that work here are imported under labour hire scams, so they don't pay any tax, and then they're able to repatriate money back to India through the various scams, labour hire scams, people smuggling type scams and so on. So that they're working in Australia, it generates no tax. Whatever surplus money they've got goes back to India, and so on. So if you just taxed the repatriation to India at 50% or something like that, then that again would mean the incentive to come here, come to the West or come to Australia. That's why a lot of people go, well, there's no point if I can't repatriate money back to my relatives in India with a much lower cost of living economy, then there's no point in me going to Australia and working if I can't repatriate or going to a white Western country. So just two very simple things there. You can't have you can't marry someone from the village of your ancestors, and you can't repatriate funds or send money back to your relatives. That would be, just removing those incentives, removing those things would be massive disincentive. Hardly any Indians would want to come here, or a very small number. Only the most highly qualified would want to come here, which are the ones you want anyway. So, and very small numbers of them. And also, the people that are particularly repatriating money and through the labour hire, they're all and remember, massive corruption is just a way of life in India. You can't have a shit without bribing somebody there. So that would take out the already very corrupt diaspora that pretty much runs and administers the Indian crowd out in the Western countries. So that would take that out. Now you can do other things like say, well, it's going to be, if you come to Australia as a say temporary resident, you've got 10 years before you can claim any, only 15 years before you can bring out any relatives, and and then they've got 10 years before they can access. So you could tighten that sort of thing up, which would again create very substantial disincentive. The other thing you do is, say, if people come out and work, come to study in Australia, it has to be a legitimate, internationally recognised course of study, not some fucking nail painting or dishwashing college that the Indians set up as a scam to provide student visas to people who then work under the table for cash, or work in the Indian-owned take-out food shops and that. So that's a massive scam that could easily be tidied up. And again, that would be a large disincentive, particularly for the criminal gangs and the corrupt parties to get involved. So these are fairly, these don't have to be big acts of Congress or Parliament. These could be done administratively, almost under the radar, but they would make a very big difference to the amount of Indians that want to come to Australia, but also the amount that would self-deport if they had to exist under those conditions. So the amount of things, again, they can be done administratively. The amount of things you don't need big dramatic things. You can just quietly do some administrative acts. Now they're quite happy to do administrative acts to go after white people and so on. That's all very much under the radar, and we're going to tighten up this so that we can arrest white people for being Nazis. All those administrative things happen. So that the government's got no problem in doing this quiet in the back room administrative things, but so they can be done here if there's a will to do it. So that would have two effects. One, millions would self-deport, and also millions would be discouraged from coming to the West unless they met a high bar of qualifications and work experience and needed skills and so on. Now, the existence of millions of effectively slave labour through scam labour hire fronts and so on, working in take-out food shops. This on one side, people say, well, look, it reduces the price of take-out food. That's a good thing. But the issue is the amount of businesses that exist in the take-out food far more than there would otherwise exist, because they can access this artificially cheap slave labour. And the profits are all repatriated back to India, and the finance for doing this is all through financial, offshore financial scams and so on. So the actual benefit to the community in Australia is actually very slight. But it also creates this huge distortion. There are tens of thousands of businesses that economically could not exist if they paid the proper wages. They just couldn't exist. So they can only exist through tax scams and offshore scams, labour hire scams, peasant labour, slave labour, all these sort of scams. That's the only way they can exist. So that creates a massive distortion in the economy. So it's effectively a parallel economy that doesn't exist, having to meet market forces. Now, if market forces did exist and the proper rates of pay, there would be far fewer businesses, but also it would mean that the type of organisational structure that these businesses in say, for example, take out food, would have to be much more professional, that it had to be real developments in organisation, much more professional management, and so on and so on. Whereas now the management, the quality of management at that level is absolutely piss poor, because they don't need to be. They can access all these cheap slave labour, like the labour hire scams and so on. So it's creating a lot of distortions that need to be corrected, and this would have the effect of doing it. Now, there are other things that could be done. For example, that as I mentioned a moment ago, if you want to get a student visa, it has to be a legitimate course, and you have to stay at that. If you quit that course, then you have to go back to India. That's it. So also, if educational rigor was introduced, the Indians and to a lesser extent the Chinese, but the Indians certainly, they believe when they've paid for the degree, for the study, and whatever the degree is in, they pay that means they have to get it. We've given you the money, you give me the fucking bit of paper. That's it, and that's the attitude they have in India. It's the corrupt attitude. The idea they're going to be examined, rigorously examined on their on their knowledge and what they've studied and so on. They think that's just lunacy. That's silly white man's bullshit. Why should they have to meet that high standard, that rigorous standard? You've got my fucking money. That's all you need. Bear in mind, a lot of the kids, the Indian kids that can afford the big bucks, come from the Brahmin caste, and they believe they're sort of semi-godlike, and gods don't have to sit for exams, and why should they? So this is very much part of the gig. So if rigor was introduced to the university, then many wouldn't come to that. You've got no right to examine me or anything like that. Which, by the way, fits in with the Brahmins. That when Brahmins first started coming to Australia in numbers, they were claiming to be PhDs in computer programming, and it was all bullshit. They couldn't cut a line of code to save their fucking lives. But they were outraged that they would be held to account for their lies because they have a certain social standing, and it's an absolute outrage if you question it. So that would limit that. So you could drastically reduce the intake, and at the same time, turbocharge people who would self-deport. Now, the Chinese too have the arranged marriages and bring out the brides and so on. Not as bad as the Indians, but they still have it. They do integrate, not to a great extent, but they've got this, as the Indians do. They've got this terrible things where they will only spend money amongst their diaspora. I mean, they'll buy, they'll go to the national chain of grocery stores or something and buy stuff if they have to, but generally for anything else and anything really of import, they will quite rigorously insist that they only spend money in their own diaspora. So if you're going to spend money, you must spend it with a Chinese business and so on. And a lot of the Chinese mafia-type financing people that give you finance to say start a business or buy a house, these sorts of things, they insist that you only use Chinese people and Chinese businesses to renovate your house. If you're going to buy a washing machine or something, then you only buy it from a Chinese-owned businesses, and they're quite brutal on that. And if you don't do it, someone's going to be knocking on your door. Why not? Don't do it again, and so on. And by the way, you've got relatives back in China. We'll make sure that they suffer if you don't do as you're told. So all their the gardener, the pool cleaner, the guys who come and renovate the house, everybody the money must be spent within the Chinese diaspora, and they're so again, this creates a very artificial parallel economy. So the same sort of thing if they repatriate funds, and the use of nominee. The Indians do this, but the Chinese are particularly bad for this use of nominee. So the mafia, the Communist Party general goon will own 500 properties, but they're all through nominees and relatives and friends that are pretending, or whatever, third cousins that are actually buying the properties on his behalf. He actually owns it, but they're just fronting for him. This is an outrageous, and it's a huge scam happening all over the Western world and in Australia too. These sorts of things, they stop and disallow that. If those are really dealt with rigor. Again, a lot of Chinese just won't come here. They're only really slave nominees to do the bidding of the mafia goons back in China, with threats to their family if they don't comply. So we need to understand that India, China, these places, they're very, very, very corrupt places, where the mafia just run things. And do we want subset economies and societies in Australia and in the West generally that are controlled by these people? The Chinese government is openly talking about wherever a Chinese diaspora exists is Greater China. So do we want to encourage that sort of thing, or be a party to it? So again, addressing these things, which again, repeating, can all be done administratively, will encourage people to self-deport and will limit the amount of people that want to come. All we have to do is eliminate the scams, and we're on the right foot. Now, the next layer is discouraging the infrastructure that brings these peasants into the West. Now, all these NGOs are operating as charities that provide that international infrastructure to bring people into the West, the mass immigration of the third world surplus population peasants. And so none of these NGO outfits are charities, and so they should be, their charity status should be removed, and they should pay tax. And if they're encouraging illegal immigration, as they are, then they should be penalised for it and dragged through the courts and fined. That again, that would just collapse the entire people movement infrastructure. So these are all things that we've done, and none of them are radical, even remotely radical. But they will stop the mass immigration, and let's hope that President Trump starts putting some of these things together, because they'll make a massive difference. So all those gazillions of people that are legally going to the US can be kicked out. Now, like somebody's saying, well, all these people really work hard and they pay tax. No, they don't. That's crap. No, they don't do that at all. Now, if there's a small percentage, 3 or 4 or 5% of them that have jobs and are integrating and are paying taxes and this and that next thing, and they're model citizens, then okay, why shouldn't they stay? What's wrong with that? And nothing's wrong with it. But that'll be the sort of numbers. It'll be at the outside, it'll be 5. Let's be absolutely super generous. At the outside, 10% of those that are illegal in the United States or have recently arrived, maximum 10% would be desirable citizens. The rest really all need to go. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.